Canada's Deeper Insights webinar series. It is always my pleasure to welcome you. My name is Ruth Ann Marley from Tech Canada. Today, I'm particularly excited because we have a panel of experts here to share some information with everyone who's logging in today. And I want to encourage you to please put your questions in the question box. There will be a lot of content delivered today, and I'm sure that many of you will have several questions or comments to add to it. So I would really like to encourage your participation in this. So I'm going to start with some very brief introductions and welcome the panel today. So our first contestant, I was going to say, our first panelist will be Daria Hobeika. Daria brings her legal expertise and her strategic advisor hat to this role today. She is a former chief of staff and a political advisor to the ministers of the government of Quebec. And so she will be adding her legal perspective. Cedric Robert is joining us as well. Cedric is a passionate, values-based entrepreneur. He has had a lot of experience prior to joining Clearsum in managing specialized environmental consultancies and renewable energy producers. So I welcome Cedric. And François Senez. François has built his career in the banking sector. He's led a team of management in large assets, and he brings the financial acumen to the panelists today. So I think it's fabulous that we have the legal, the business, the entrepreneur, and the financial. So I'm going to turn it over to the Clearsum team right now. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Ruth Ann, for this generous introduction and for your invitation to address the tech community about climate change as a strategic business imperative. We're very happy to be with you all today. As Ruth Ann mentioned, we have a lot of content to share, so let's get started. Today, you will hear us talk about 3 topics. The first one, understanding climate change. So what are physical risks? What are transition risks? And the resulting growing pressure they are exercising on businesses and other organizations. The second topic, the strategic imperative to understand the climate. So the need for business leaders to see, to understand, to act, and to validate. And the third topic, building resilience for small and medium enterprises. So understanding what resilience is, reviewing SME-specific risks, and positioning your business to be climate ready. Our objectives today are twofold. First, to demystify the climate and its impacts on your business in a useful way to you. And second, to equip you to position yourself in tomorrow's low-carbon economy. Before we start, for a few words about our point of view. So when you think of the relationship between a company and the environment, we often think about the impact of the company on that environment. So you've heard about ESG, and the E of ESG asks you to do just that, asks you to say what your impact, your business impact is on climate change. Our point of view complements this approach, but is different. Our starting point is the company itself, and what we look at is the impact of the external environment. So the impact of climate change on your business model, on your financials, on your people, and essentially on your future. Let's see now where this point of view takes us. As we said at the beginning, understanding the impact of climate on business requires understanding 3 things. So what are physical risks? What are transition and legal risks? And the resulting growing pressure on businesses and business leaders. With respect to physical risks first, we're not going to attempt today to review the vast scientific literature on that topic, but rather highlight elements that demonstrate the magnitude of the challenge ahead. On a very high level, human activity as we know it has been made possible by the relatively stable climate we've enjoyed for about 10,000 years. Because of this same human activity, the stability of our climate is at risk today. Indeed, this activity releases substances in the atmosphere, including carbon and methane, at a greater rate than natural systems are able to absorb. As a result, the planet is warming at an unprecedented pace. Projections indicate that we might suffer in the next 50 years more warming than in the last 6,000 years. This has made extreme weather events such as floods, hurricanes, and fires more frequent, more intense, longer in duration, impactful on wider geographic locations, and increasingly variable and difficult to predict. This uncertainty is exacerbated because we are approaching what we call tipping points. Tipping points are a zone of uncertainty about how natural systems are going to react, and they are characterized by nonlinear and cascading changes. In other words, in the scientific community today, there is relative confidence with respect to the general direction the climate is taking, but a lot of uncertainty about the exact path that it will take to get there. As a result, you've got different climate scenarios, different models and modeling approaches, which are essentially plausible versions of the changes that will occur in the future based on different assumptions. Now, what does this mean for a business? It means increasing direct risks. So direct floods on an office tower, for example, that would make it inaccessible, or a late frost that destroy crops, but also increasing indirect risks, risks on industrial processes, on supply chain, on human resource availability, etc. We will hear more detailed examples about both these risks later in the presentation. And obviously for businesses, these increased risks have a cost. The question we think businesses should ask themselves is thus, how much is it going to cost to do nothing, so to incur the risk? And how much is it going to cost to adjust your strategy and get ready for a low carbon economy? Looking at costs overall, what we know is that environmental and climate issues dominate the World Economic Forum ranking of the 5 most important long-term risks in terms of value today. In 2020, extreme weather events cost over $210 billion in the world, a new record that is unfortunately going to be broken quite soon. Indeed, it is estimated that by 2050, these events could cause $7.9 trillion in damages annually, and that by 2100, 23% of global GDP could be affected by climate change. Another way of looking at these numbers is to say that by 2050, we could be experiencing the equivalent of the financial impact of the COVID crisis in 2020, 1 or 2 times a year, every year, year after year. And this is excluding the value of biodiversity degradation. So looking at these numbers, one might think that physical risks, which are valued here, are the most important climate risks financially for businesses. And this is sometimes, but not always, the case, especially in Canada. Which brings us now to talk about transition risks. What are transition risks? So transition risks are those that result from actions of an actor in the company's external environment who decides to reduce the impact of physical risks on his own business model, and by doing so creates a financial risk for other businesses. We've grouped these actors in 3 categories: conscious stakeholders, financial actors, and government and regulatory actors. Those of you who are familiar with the TCFD reporting framework will recognize the risk reporting framework here. Let's look now at each of these categories one by one. With respect to conscious stakeholders, whom we are talking about here are consumers who are increasingly sensitive to climate issues and are essentially voting with their money by choosing products that are less harmful to the planet. Employees who are voting with their talent, leading ESG performance to become a means of attracting and retaining talent and thus a competitive advantage for businesses. Shareholders, obviously, who are voting with their shares. We saw a recent example of this at the 2021 ExxonMobil annual meeting, during which 2 directors with the environmental profiles were chosen by activists and more traditional shareholders. And finally, civil society organizations working to accelerate the movements that we just discussed. Again, as a result for businesses, this means that demand is changing. Resource availability to meet that demand is also changing. And the company is increasingly scrutinized with respect to the provenance of its products, to its processes, and to the veracity of its statements, or put more bluntly, anything that might be considered an attempt at greenwashing. The second vector of pressure comes from financial system actors. Essentially, these actors are including the cost of climate change impacts, which used to be an externality, into their core calculations. Who are these financial actors? Investors first, who are choosing to invest or withdraw investments in companies based on their assessment of the company's readiness for the economic transition. For example, last year in September, we had 500 investors representing $47 trillion in assets under management rallied under the Climate One Action banner to put pressure on companies to adopt a net zero goal. And institutional investors also, Canadian pension funds are part of that movement, who take a long-term view and are putting the same pressure on companies. We're also talking about lenders, banks notably, who are putting pressure on their clients by assessing the impact of climate risk on their business, on their loan portfolio, to ensure that they are lending at a rate that reflects the real risk and that they will be successful in retrieving that money and recovering their loans. We're talking about credit rating agencies who are beginning to integrate ESG scores into their ratings. We're talking about insurers who are increasing the price of coverage when the risk is higher, and also when it is too high, removing coverage for certain assets. And what is important to understand here, looking at these different types of actors, is that to make informed decisions, these financial players are looking for more transparency from companies. So hence the range of disclosure frameworks, TCFD, for example, the PRI is another one, that exists today to enable this transparency. And this movement is reinforced and catalyzed by international financial institutions and central banks, also pushing for the adoption of these frameworks. What we see today is that the TCFD, to name just one, is endorsed by financial institutions responsible for $150 trillion in assets worldwide. Bringing it back to the business once again, what does this mean? It means that businesses who are looking for more advantageous loans, investment by third parties, and complete insurance for their activities, among other things, must understand the pressure that these financial actors are facing and putting on them, and be ready to respond to it. The final and third group of actors that we'll address today are political and regulatory actors, who obviously have a fundamental role to play in moving towards the economic transition. What have governments done to date? Well, essentially, after years of negotiations, the Paris Agreement was concluding. Today, 125 countries have adopted net zero targets, essentially a pledge to, by 2050 or 2060, in the case of China, not add more carbon into the atmosphere than we are able to remove from it. And without going into the details here, we want to highlight 4 different elements about the regulatory perspective. The first is that despite these pledges and despite current government commitments, they are insufficient to meet the Paris Accord targets. And even when countries have made plans to meet their own targets, usually these plans are insufficient to meet the targets. So there is still a long way to go there. The second element is that the longer governments wait, the more drastic and disruptive the decisions that they will have to take will be for citizens and for the economy. This is a difference between what is termed an orderly transition that could create jobs and create wealth, and a disorderly transition that would put these jobs and that wealth at risk. The third element we want to highlight is that there is not a single solution or a single law that will suffice to address what is a complex issue that requires action on multiple fronts. There's been, for example, a lot of debate in Canada about the price of carbon. But the economic transformation that is required is much larger than putting a price on carbon. We need new ways of doing things, so important investments in innovation. Major changes in our habits will be required. Only one example, in France, there is currently a bill that proposes to prohibit short-haul flights when the journey can be made by train. We need different public procurement frameworks. So in England, for companies that want public contracts must demonstrate today that they have a credible climate plan so that they are sustainable in the future. And we need different reporting requirements. This year, again, G7 leaders agreed to make climate disclosures based on the TCFD mandatory in the future. The fourth and final element we want to highlight about regulatory and policy actors is that legislative change is possible. And we're going to bring you here to think about the vast changes that we saw in 2020, the rapidity and the amplitude of these changes at different levels of government across Canada. To remember that when the situation requires it, laws and regulations are words on paper that can and will be written differently. Now, as a result of this context, what we are seeing for businesses is that climate-related legal risk and litigation is on the rise. So there are governments being sued across the world for inaction or insufficient action to protect the health and safety of populations, but there are also businesses being sued for their contribution to increased climate change. And there is a growing movement for directors of these businesses to be held responsible for not sufficiently addressing climate change, which is something that is becoming embedded in their legal responsibility. So again, what we see as a whole for a business is the resulting growing pressure that is rapidly closing in. And this pressure is complexified by two things. First of all, by the picture we just painted. When you look at what lies ahead, what we must understand is that climate change is not just a scientific or an environmental issue. It is a societal problem that requires understanding the reaction of social actors to science and how these reactions are interrelated to get a better idea of the future in front of us. It's a picture that is also complexified by the lack of understanding or knowledge of the portrait we've just drawn. We're going to cite only one example here of recent surveys that indicate that only a minority of directors believe that ESG issues have a financial impact on the company. How might this context materialize for your own business in the future? That is the question we want to address, and I will leave you with Cedric to detail it.
Thank you, Daria. Indeed, what does climate change mean, and what do all these elements that Daria just pointed out mean for your business in a day-to-day basis, and how to address them? We like to think about the intersection between climate change and business using a very simple framework. It's inspired by Professor Senez of work or perspective on business success. It's got four components to it. We must first see what is happening in the contextual environment, see what's happening in the landscape with eyes wide open. After seeing, you must start understanding the context and how it could affect the organization, looking at the causal links between what climate change is doing and how it could affect value creation at the organizational level. Once we understand, we can act. And by acting, we mean developing a climate strategy and tactical plans that will help you navigate the future and adapting to a changing climate. And because innovation is at the center of all of this, ultimately we have to test and validate, start small and scale so that our businesses could successfully transition from today's state to the low carbon economy of the future. What do we mean when we're talking about first seeing? I'm going to cite a comment that was put in front of us at the signing of a mandate recently from one of our clients. He said to us, working with our team, you'll probably discover that we suffer from tunnel vision. What we're counting on is for you to help us challenge our views using this climate perspective that you bring to the table. What our client meant was essentially that within the four walls of his organization, there's a lot of specialization. There's a lot of focus. There's a lot of determination to work on the elements that are inside that organization. Little effort is put outside of the organization to try to understand what the context is. See, it's easy to see how we can lose seeing the forest for the trees. We can all, and we have all experienced that at some point in time. But when you do pull out and take the time to look at what's happening in the landscape, you recognize and see some elements that are and could be material to your firm and how you create value. If you pull out even further, you can realize that, these could be consequential for a significant period of time. The example we're seeing here are the Fort McMurray fires in 2016. And I can assure you, many businesses looked at this and thought, my goodness, this will be costly. You may think that because you're, for example, nested and working in the renewable energy sector, that you might be sheltered from these risks, but it's not the case. It might be the golden child of how we transition to a low carbon economy. But the reality is that these assets, much like other assets that are exposed to physical risks and transition risks, are exposed to failing under pressure. In fact, I recall working for the client that owned this facility in the northeast of the province of British Columbia, and being in their office in 2014 when a fire ravaged nearby. The concerns were significant. The words that I would describe to highlight what was felt in the office was essentially fear, consternation that their asset that was in the process of being finished commission, I think it was possibly in operation, if my memory serves me well. And the reality is that we were all concerned whether or not these assets would survive a fire. And I can assure you that they had to fend calls from investors, lenders, and insurers on the topic. What do we need to see well? Well, I think it boils down to two things. We need access to the right information and data, and that data has to be of high quality. It has to be on two fronts: what we know about the contextual environment and what we know about the internal environment of the firm. How do we go about this? Well, it all begins by identifying the information sources that we're looking for and making sure they're of high quality. This data has to be quality data. Internally, we might be looking at our GHG emissions. Externally, we want to have access to information on risks, impacts, climate drivers, and signals that if they arise in the horizon, we know that we can see how they may affect or think about how they may affect organizational value creation. Once we have the right information and data in hand, we have to structure it, make it accessible, retrievable, and decision useful. At this point, we can establish some form of monitoring system that enables us to look at those risks, the drivers and signals that are evolving in the landscape. And at that point, we can start looking at these and looking at plausible consequences. How could this affect the organization? What's a common vision on these effects? And then seek to understand how to mitigate them. How do we understand? We look at causal links. We look at causal links between those external elements and value creation. We like to use Porter's value chain because it's fairly straightforward and simple. It describes the main activities of an organization as well as its supporting activities. And all of this leads to one thing: how does it affect our margins? Let's take the example of a physical risk, a thunderstorm with lightning that had caused a fire. And let's stay in the renewable energy sector. So we know that a fire could interrupt, for example, the distribution of energy that comes from a generating asset, a plant, a wind plant. And if it disrupts it, we may be obligated to essentially stop production because we don't have anywhere for that energy to land. With a closure of a site, it forces some form of reflection internally to understand what are the consequences of this closure in the immediate, short term, and then moderate term. While we sit down with the administration, we look at the business, and we can trace back all of these actions or consequences and events from the outer world context to various elements of how value is created within our organization. From the infrastructure to the human resources to our operations, sales, and services, all of which lands in one single spot. It affects our margins. And what do we know is that if it affects our margins, someone will be standing there having to explain those consequences and how to mitigate them to either investors, lenders, or insurers at the very least. In and of itself, that creates an array of other risks. We think, okay, physical risks, pretty straightforward causal links. Let's look at the transition risk, for example. Let's take copper, a precious a mineral that is currently in incredible demand because of the evolution we're seeing in the transport industry. It's essentially in every electrical vehicle we see out there. Copper is also an integral element to how we generate, transmit, control the generation of power, electricity. What we know is that the evolution of the electric vehicle has caused a shortage, among other things, of about 500,000 tons of copper in the market today, squeezing the supply. Squeeze of supply means one thing. It means an increase in cost and reduced availability. What could that do to your organization? It could tip the balance on a number of fronts and prevent you, for example, to do some servicing on your facility that is mandated for it to continue operating. It could be, for example, putting on hold a project that is currently in construction because of delays, or if you have parked capital somewhere and using capital from an institution of some sort, it could delay a project for a significant period of time. We saw this in the movement of green energy in British Columbia in the early 2005s with steel. If these consequences are then traced back to the value chain, we can quickly realize that a number of elements of how we create value are affected. Consequences, it affects our margins. If it affects our margins, someone's going to have to talk to the outside world, which in and of itself brings the same set of risks that we talked about earlier. Since these tangible risks can affect profitability and ultimately your competitiveness, as well as, if you look at this in the long run, your organization's relevancy, doesn't this make climate change a strategic imperative? We certainly believe so. And furthermore, what is science telling us right now with the latest reports from the UN IPCC on the effects of climate change? It's telling us that these risks are going to increase in frequency, in intensity, in duration, and the variability will increase as well. But how do we act? How do we knowingly go from here to taking a course of action? We build a strategy and tactical plans. There are two fundamental components of a sound climate strategy. The first one, mitigating your impacts on climate. This is what we hear about everywhere right now, the idea of reducing your GHG emissions. That's fantastic. It's an essential component of a strategy, but it does not assure you that you will remain competitive or resilient and or relevant in the long run. So a second component is this need to create adaptation so that you can increase your organizational resilience. What you'll notice here is that, excuse me, is that there's a substantial amount of action happening in this next decade. It is coined as the decisive decade. If we want to hope that by 2050, we live in an environment that is aligned with the Paris Agreement. Of importance, neither of these successful, or the implementation of these components and actions relative to these components can happen without innovation embedded at the heart of all of this. You'll need to innovate to mitigate your impacts. You'll need to innovate to adapt and build organizational resilience. Let's go a bit deeper into this. How could an organization reduce its impact on climate change? We're going to stick with GHG emissions, but at a very, very high level. This entails evaluating your emission sources, creating an inventory, quantifying those emissions. Then once you have that data in hand, you can prioritize and estimate the value of projects that could contribute to reducing those emissions. You then need to communicate internally, just like you would with any other project, to start building traction. You'll develop plans, identify your objectives, and eventually secure the capital needed to execute your projects. Once you've got to go ahead, it embeds into your process. You monitor the progress and quality of efforts, and you start improving on what you're doing. I strongly recommend that you celebrate your small wins as you move forward. This is just one risk of an array of risks that you will need to manage. Let's call it maybe not an internal risk, but certainly a relevancy-related risk in some capacity. The second component is to look broader. It's to increase your climate resilience and climate adaptation. This is where you look at the landscape, at the contextual environment, gather all of these risks, and look at your exposure and sensitivity so that you can land with an idea of where you're and what you're facing. At that point, you can start analyzing a series of scenarios and testing your business strategy against these scenarios. Is the current path that I'm on relevant tomorrow and into the future? Once you've got an idea of how relevant that strategy is, you can start developing a number of projects, a strategic plan, some tactical plans, and begin implementing these projects one by one, following the same process I described earlier. You monitor your progress, the quality of your efforts, and then, most importantly, in our opinion, is you start talking about it, disclosing, sharing your advancements, and François will tell you why this is important. An important note here is that as you advance through this process, your external stakeholders will look at what you're doing, and this trend is increasing in the landscape, the entire point of François' conversation. They'll assess you on the basis of your ambition, of your alignment within the organization, and how consistent you are between your words and your actions. But I'll let François tell you more. And as I mentioned, that innovation needs to be at the center of all this because we don't have the answers to everything today. You need to test and validate. You need to pilot and start small. Establish and review a series of performance indicators, confirm that your projects are aligned with your strategic plans, and then you move forward. You monitor them, you perform the work to create the desired changes, and then you adjust those plans as needed. And critically, because it requires courage internally and entrepreneurship to move forward, you should manage those changes in some form of participatory manner and support internal stakeholders as they move along. I will, at this point, let François take over and start talking to you about, from this point, now that you've seen, understood, acted, and validated, how you could build resilience. Thank you.
Thank you, Cedric, for helping us understand what climate change means for businesses and the link to value creation and organizational strategy. We'll now explore how climate risk impact small and medium enterprises and how you can increase your strategic position and business resilience in a changing climate. Some climate risk impact SMEs' business models more acutely than others. So understanding your exposure is key to building resilience. This requires using present and forward-looking climate data to explore the future climate projections and intersect these with your own operations, building your personal internal risk register. It is useful to know that a good body of this data is publicly available. So once identified, risk should be embedded in risk management processes and incorporated into strategic planning. For each, you will need to identify your degree of vulnerability by looking at your sensitivity to the risks and your adaptive capacity to respond to that risks. Over time, stress testing your business model and financials to simulate shocks and effects of chronic financial impacts will allow you to quantify climate risks. And this is known as conducting, you might have heard about that, a climate scenario analysis. So several sophisticated tools also exist on the market. We could provide some if you'd like. You can write to us, but there's a lot of tools that exist on the market to help you do that. So this process will teach your organization to better see and understand the implications of climate change and help inform your decisions. And it's going to define your vision and better position your strategy. This is foundational to becoming resilient in a changing climate. But you might say, in practical terms, what does this mean? So let's look at 6 climate risks that may be material to many of you and their potential impacts on your businesses. First one is about greenhouse gas emissions. So in light of Canada's commitment to reduce its carbon emissions, we expect regulators to take increasingly important action impacting a broader spectrum of our economy, and for example, through higher carbon taxes or border carbon adjustments tariffs. We'll talk about those later in the presentation. In this context, several large enterprises have also committed to reduce or net zero emissions, requiring them to assess and reduce upstream emissions from suppliers and downstream emissions from distributors as well as their own. So not only their emissions, but the emissions of their counterpart. So Apple is a good example. Apple's decarbonization objective for its supply chain and product to be net zero by 2030 resulted in over 100 of its global suppliers shifting to 100% renewable energy supply. So you can just imagine the impact of this shift for a business supplied by non-renewable energy. Imagine it is your business. So what would losing one of your big clients to a greener competitor mean for your business? In the past, Canada and other G20 countries have also demonstrated increasing interest in border carbon adjustment, an instrument that reduces or eliminates the risk of carbon leakage by ensuring that imported goods face the same carbon price adjustments than goods made domestically. Again, let's just think about what would a 10 or 20% increase in cost of imports mean for your business. Would you need to consider a significant modification to your supply chain? That's just something to reflect on. So let us look also at access to capital. Access to capital is the other most importance for SMEs as they are looking to grow and don't have access to the same resources as larger enterprise. So as we saw earlier, as banks and financial institutions integrate climate externalities, businesses operating in or supplying the heavy emitter sector may find it harder to access traditional lending and competitive rates. The most advanced banks might require climate mitigation and adaptation plans from clients as they implement climate criteria in their investment decisions. Some have also divested from brown investments and projects, reducing their exposure to carbon emissions and their portfolio risks, and helping them meet disclosure requirements that they've made to the market. Interestingly, some banks are offering consulting and support services to their clients and helping them de-risk their business model by reducing their own loan book exposure to climate risks. Other instruments such as sustainability linked loans are also growing in importance, now accounting for a quarter of green debt issuance around the globe. Since for every goal the borrower meets or misses, interest payments will fall or rise, these loans incentivize the borrower's sustainability achievements. In this context, we want to ask ourselves, what is my business doing to meet the growing demand and expectations of its lenders and investors? How are we positioned to keep having access to competitive capital and interesting terms in a low carbon economy? Let's now look at increased operational costs and frequency of business disruption. SMEs are highly sensitive to operating margins as their ability to transfer higher operational costs is usually limited in a competitive environment where their clients have positional power. As governments implement mitigation responses, costs might be passed on to businesses, which they may or not be able to pass on to customers and clients. Another operational cost impact is the potential rise of the price of specific minerals supporting the transition to a low carbon economy. We heard of copper earlier with Cedric, and the same could be said about lithium and other specific minerals. And what if these minerals were also used to manufacture chips, like in the automotive sector? Could you withstand the pressure of lengthy and costly interruptions to your manufacturing process? What if your business was dependent on these materials for its operations? And even more problematic, even might be the resulting business disruptions, as it did recently in the automotive sector in the case of shortage of chips. Another risk is water scarcity, and it's a good example. So it exacerbated by climate change. Studies mentioned that it could cost some regions up to 6% of their GDP, spur migration, and spark conflict, according to the World Bank. In 2021, for the first time, the US declares a shortage on the Colorado River, forcing water cuts all around. Farmers in Arizona were forced to reduce their water consumption, and businesses across 7 states, namely California, could be affected by the governmental contingency plan around water scarcity. Finally, a recent study demonstrated that the effects of climate change on health will increase employee sick days and reduce productivity. In the EU and the US, several leading organizations and businesses are altering their building designs to cope with these anticipated extreme weather events, resulting in direct increases in their operational costs. We can only imagine the same will be true in Canada and will affect all businesses, including SMEs. So let's now look also at customer preferences and the impact on the top line. Since SMEs' sales can be volatile while they differentiate their products and build competitive advantage, the impact of shifts of consumer preferences must be taken into consideration. As mentioned earlier, customer preferences are changing to demand increased climate considerations, reduced impact, and improved sustainability from businesses in the Western world. Recent surveys indicate 79% of buyers change their preferences based on sustainability, and 69% of consumers worldwide change products and services due to concern about climate change. Could this be material to your business? How long could you sustain also an impact of 5% decrease in revenues if your customers' preferences change? Exploring the cost of adapting your product or services to reduce your environmental impact may be timely. Let's now look at talent attraction and retention. Attracting and retaining top talent is vital for SMEs looking to expand their operations and market shares. As we saw earlier, employees are increasing voting with their talents, such as ESG performance has become a criteria for human resources attraction and retention. This is especially true for millennials and Gen Zers, who will soon make up the largest segment of the workforce. Indeed, a company's effort towards tackling climate change has been found to affect where 48.5% of professionals want to work, and 75% of millennials express willingness to accept a pay cut, with 10% willing to give up to $5,000 to $10,000 to work at an environmentally friendly company. In this era of shortage of talent, how is your business positioned to meet your talent needs? Let's now look at increased cost of insurance and decreased insurability. Finally, SMEs' ability to withstand material risks in their risk appetite is limited by the availability of resources to adapt to a shock. Insurance is an important tool for SME to mitigate and prevent them from critical impacts of risks. Today, to limit their losses, insurers will opt to adjust their premiums and reconsider insurability to reflect gradually emerging impacts of climate change. In the Fort McMurray example presented earlier by Cedric, wildfires resulted in total insured damages of 4.5 billion Canadian. Less than 3 years later, the same community experienced flooding that caused 562 million in insured damages, the majority related to commercial properties. More recently, 2 hailstorms in and around Calgary and flooding and windstorm damage in Edmonton resulted in 2 billion in damages. So the economic impacts of events like flooding include increased costs associated with the premature replacement of assets, inventory, and infrastructure, and providing emergency services and rising insurance costs. And where policyholders are underinsured or cannot be insured, impacts could affect their business long-term sustainability. By discussing these 6 potential climate change risks and their impacts on Canadian businesses and their supply chain, our objective was to raise awareness and hopefully address key strategic blind spots. Now let us look at how SMEs can build resilience in the face of climate risks. So what does building resilience mean? So resilience is defined as a company's capacity to absorb stress, recover critical functionality, and thrive in altered circumstances. In an increasingly dynamic and unpredictable context, as climate puts pressure on businesses, resilience gains in importance. To build resilience, it is instrumental that organizations equip themselves with tools and processes that would help them build the capacity to see, understand, and act. Better tools mean better decisions, enhanced visibility on the landscape, and better strategy. You can position yourself to be climate ready by ensuring you have the wind in your sails at your back rather than facing headwinds. This requires preparing to face stakeholder demands and expectations for potential merger and acquisition, to obtain better or the best financing possible, and to strengthen your supply chain. Let's explore some examples. By assessing, understanding, and disclosing the carbon footprint of your products and services, and by setting ambitious science-based targets to reduce these, you can position yourself to attract the increasingly large pool of conscious consumers, as well as attract and retain top talent. Consumers, especially millennials and Gen Zers, are increasingly aware and active when it comes to corporate sustainability. This requires developing and integrating strategies that cater to their needs and expectations. Important consideration should be given to positioning your business to incorporate climate-ready and sustainable practices in its processes. When it comes to attracting investors and catering to the future needs of your lenders, increasing transparency on your climate risk and opportunities, how you manage these, And by having in hand effective mitigation and adaptation plans will help you position you favorably to meet their expectations. This should not be overlooked. The 2020 Edelman Trust Perimeter Special Report on Institutional Investors reported that 88% of limited partnership globally use ESG performance indicators in making investment decisions. And 87% mention investing in companies that have reduced their near-term return on capital so they can reallocate that money to ESG initiatives. Looking at M&As now, we argue that companies involved in mergers and acquisition also need to be aware of risk related to climate change. These may come up in a transactional context. While not every deal will involve climate change related diligence, more and more industries are subjected to climate risks as well as climate regulations and legal actions. One influential survey in private equity reported that 36% of respondents considered climate risk at the due diligence stage to understand and/or mitigate the exposure of their portfolios. On the buy side, you should carefully evaluate compliance risk of your target and your future acquisition, and should be in a position to understand the current state of climate change regulations and determine if and how these may affect its financial performance. A buyer should carefully look at fixed assets of a seller and consider their geographic locations and the potential impacts of physical and transition climate risks. On the sell side, businesses can make themselves more appealing to buyers by demonstrating climate resilience through sound mitigation and adaptation planning. Climate change could impact the number of available buyers in the market as they become more aware of the climate change risk and opportunities. A potential net outcome could be reduced competition for your business, resulting in a drop in valuation because of high exposure to climate risks, or on the contrary, you could also be positioned to profit from climate opportunities. Let's look at your supply chain. So finally, understanding your role in the supply chain is an important element of your future strategic positioning. With the interruptions that happened in the supply chain around the world last year due to COVID-19, concerns about resilience and climate risk exposure of supply chains worldwide have increased, specifically with respect to acute weather events and GHG emissions. As pointed out by a contributor to the MIT's Business Management publication, a company is only as good as protected as its suppliers. In that regard, according to McKinsey and Company, businesses should be prepared to assess and understand climate change impacts based on their upstream or downstream location in the supply chain. Businesses at the downstream end of the chain may be affected directly by acute weather events due to damages to assets, or indirectly due to interruption upstream of their supply chain. These businesses can prepare for such events by dual sourcing, for example, or by increasing inventory levels to maintain production during interruption. Of course, they should also work to protect their assets from direct climate exposures. Producers or upstream participants, on the other hand, are less exposed to indirect impacts. For them, adapting and mitigating to the direct impacts of climate-related events could include building disaster-proof facilities, obtaining disaster insurance, and developing emergency procedures or comprehensive business continuity plan. Such practices could be expensive for SMEs. However, early investment may be insignificant when compared to the potential losses avoided from acute physical events. To help mitigate your risk, consider engaging in the long-term collaborations across your supply chain partners. By doing so and sharing practices, collaborators could potentially influence how one of its chain partners may be performing, helping pull the partner upward to help reduce risk exposure. Let's now look at 6 actions to build resilience. According to a Harvard Business Review article, business that we will provide after that presentation, and the business leaders can increase resilience through 6 actions. The first one is seek advantage in adversity. Ensure that your vision goes beyond risk mitigation to encompass creating a competitive advantage and capitalizing on opportunities in the face of adversity. The second one is to look forward. Use actual and anticipated crises to accelerate your long-term vision. Identify new contextual needs and opportunities for your stakeholders. Identify and monitor key risk drivers. The third action is to take a collaborative systems view. Promote systems thinking within the firm and systemic solutions by nurturing collaborations. Complex problems require using multidisciplinary approach instead of a single view to identify blind spots and shed lights on new opportunities. The fourth action is to measure more than just performance. As well as typical KPIs, measure your capacity to adapt and your increased corporate and institutional knowledge, as both contribute to building resilience. The fifth action is about valuing the diversity. So we know that cognitive diversity, or diversity of views and thoughts originating from different parties with different backgrounds, experience, and expertise, allows your business to see things with fresh eyes, an important element of resilience. And the last action that you can take is to accept change as the new business as usual, to adopt an iterative mindset as a default operating mode to help reduce the risk associated with change. And all of these actions leads to increased resilience for your business and long-term sustainability. We'd be happy to come back and engage in more details on these frameworks and how to apply them. Our goal today was to help start a reflection that will lead to action. And this concludes our presentation today, and we hope that you found it informative and helpful. We firmly believe that by setting yourself up to be first to see, first to understand, and first to act, you'll be in a position, your organization, to be rewarded by the market and your stakeholders. And becoming climate ready is a journey, so just start today. Thank you very much.
I want to thank all three of you for your presentation. You have touched on several aspects. Complexified was one of the first things that I pulled out of yours, Daria. And I'm hoping that people will put in some comments and some questions into the question box for all of you. Cedric, thank you for looking at that broader view and asking everyone to, see where their tunnel vision might be and extending that vision out to, again, segue perfectly into what François was saying, to understand better the risk exposure to a business and to the impact. And I think all of you have touched on the fact that change is the new normal. And I hate that term, but embracing change and recognizing and being prepared for change on a consistent basis. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I was going to build on this. Thank you, Ruth Ann, for hosting us today. And, it seems, and this is a point that we raise with our clients, it seems like we're facing a mountain when we think about climate change and how to integrate elements of climate change considerations in how we do business. But the fact is that there are substantial elements and several elements that leaders in organizations, small and large, do already. They do have an eye on what's happening outside, but sometimes it's just a matter of shifting that perspective ever slightly so that we can end up in a position where we see it with a climate lens. What could this mean? And to ask yourself the right questions. It's by tackling a series of molehills that you get to the point of being and creating this adaptation and resilience that we're looking for, or that we're sort of advising our customer base with.
Excellent. Yeah, taking it in small pieces. Rula has a question here, and I think it might be for all of you, but I'm going to put it out there. As part of the systems thinking, should organizations design and improve processes around proposed actions to take, or what's sort of, again, this is taking those small bites?
Daria, do you want to give it a shot? So I think processes are certainly critical. You can't not look at them, but I think it has to fit within a strategy or something that is more global and broader at the top. It has to start with looking at what we're doing today and how to align what we're doing today with what the needs are tomorrow, and doing a bit of foresighting in that process. And once you understand the expectations of the future, to the best possible, then you start modifying processes. And we cannot overemphasize the need to start small and to not go at this by thinking we're going to do wholesale changes. We have to protect the way that we create value. This is a transitional state. This is something that we're doing over time. So I would say processes are key, but like anything else, communicating those changes internally and becoming a flag bearer, a bit of a champion of change management, so that the world around you knows that you're taking these actions. We hear all the time, for example, this idea of talent retention and talent acquisition. We hear it all over the place right now. There's a gap in the talent base. How do we tackle this? How do we attract them? How do we retain them? It's by taking and raising some champions within the organizations and communicating those changes. I hope that answers the question straight a bit, but
excellent. And yes, the hunt for talent, and they were saying, Harvard Business Review has put a lot of articles about, the great exodus, and that, we have a huge, sort of flush of extremely talented people out there who you could engage with. I just wanted to say to everyone who's on the line that this has been recorded. It will be on our Tech Canada website for your review, so you can go back through some of the slides, listen to, again, some of the breakdown of each aspect that both Daria, François, and Cedric put into their presentation. And also, I want to encourage any of you who would like to reach out to Clearsum. They have assembled this extremely skilled team of professionals that really is that intersection of business, finance, policy, and environment. So if you really are looking for a source for your business, and I'm glad, François, you talked about SMEs and small businesses, because everybody thinks, oh, this is something for the big guys. This is, how am I as a small business going to deal with this? So thank you again to all of you for participating with us. And again, thanks again. Take care.
Have a great day.
Thank you, Rutan.
Thank you.
Thank you.